Grace Oak had exactly $1 left to her name. But then a shivering child walked through the diner door, and she spent it anyway. She had no idea the man in the corner was watching every second of it. The diner was cold and half empty on a bitter Tuesday night. Grace moved between tables the way she always did, efficiently, invisibly, with the quiet dignity of a woman carrying more than anyone around her could see. Then the boy appeared. He stood just inside the door, small, thin, wearing a dark hoodie fraying at the elbows and sneakers splitting at the sole. No older than 8. In his small fist, a handful of copper pennies. His large hazel eyes swept the room once, carefully, the way children look around when they are trying very hard not to cry. Grace crossed the floor without thinking. She crouched to his level, ordered him the warmest bowl of stew on the menu, and paid for it with the last dollar she had in the world. She never once looked at the corner booth. She never saw the man sitting there, dark suit, black overcoat, blue-gray eyes completely still, watching her with the quiet intensity of someone who had just witnessed something he hadn't seen in years. When he finally stood to leave, he placed a thick, sealed envelope on the table. Nobody in that diner was ready for what was inside it. "Stay with me, dearest. This one is going to be worth every second of your time." Nobody moved at first. The diner door had barely swung shut behind the stranger before the cold he left behind settled over the room like a held breath. Grace stood at the corner booth, the thick cream envelope in her hands, turning it over once the way you turn over something you're not sure is real. No name on the front, no address. Just the envelope, and the dark wax seal pressed into a perfect circle on the back, and the very particular weight of something that didn't belong in a place like this. Donna, the night cook, leaned through the kitchen window. "What is it?" Grace didn't answer. She wasn't sure she could. Caleb was still in his booth, scraping the last of the stew from the bottom of the bowl with the focused dedication that only hungry children possess. His sneaker, the one splitting at the sole, tapped quietly against the booth leg. He had no idea anything had changed. He was just a boy finishing his dinner, and that small, ordinary thing made Grace's chest ache in a way she couldn't quite name. She carried the envelope to the counter. Donna came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Marcus, the busboy, drifted over without being asked. Even Mr. Holt, the manager, emerged from his office with the slow, suspicious energy of a man who had learned that nothing good ever happened in his diner after 9 o'clock. "Open it," Donna said. Grace broke the wax seal. Inside was a single folded document and a business card so heavy and clean it felt like it had never been touched before. She unfolded the document with careful hands, smoothed it against the counter, and read it once. Then she read it again because the first time didn't make sense. The room went completely silent. It was a certified check. $50,000 made out to Grace Oak, signed at the bottom in a clean, decisive hand. Beneath it, 3 typed lines that rearranged everything she thought she knew about this night. Vale Industries, Director of Community Relations. Report Monday, 8 a.m. Donna made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Marcus took a step backward as if the paper might bite him. Mr. Holt snatched the business card from the counter and turned it over. His face did something Grace had never seen it do before. It went completely, utterly still. She knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name. Warren Vale, 42 floors of glass and steel downtown. Billions managed before breakfast. The kind of man whose decisions moved through the city like weather. You felt the effects long before you understood the cause. Grace looked down at the check again. Her last dollar had bought a hungry child a bowl of stew. And somehow, that had been enough to make a billionaire stop, sit down, and decide to change her life completely. She just didn't know yet what saying yes was truly going to cost her. Grace almost didn't go. She stood outside her apartment building Monday morning at 7:45, dressed in the best thing she owned. A navy blazer she had pressed 3 times the night before, dark slacks with a hem she'd repaired herself, and the only pair of closed-toe shoes that didn't have a scuff she couldn't hide. She had rehearsed what she would say on the subway. She had rehearsed it again waiting for the traffic light. By the time Vale Industries came into view, every rehearsed word had abandoned her completely. The building was extraordinary. 42 floors of pure glass rising out of the city like something the skyline had been quietly saving space for. The morning light hit it at an angle that made the whole structure look like it was glowing from the inside. People moved through the revolving doors with the smooth, purposeful energy of those who belong without question in spaces like this. Tailored coats, expensive shoes, the particular confidence of people who have never once had to repair a hem. Grace touched the envelope in her bag, felt its weight. She walked through the doors. The lobby was enormous and impossibly quiet for a building this alive. White marble floors, ceilings that soared, a reception desk that looked longer than her entire apartment. The woman behind it glanced up, assessed Grace in a single second, and smiled the careful smile of someone professionally trained not to react. "Grace Oak," Grace said before she could lose her nerve. "I have an 8 o'clock." The receptionist's expression shifted subtly, but genuinely. "Mr. Vale is expecting you, 42nd floor." The elevator ride was the longest 30 seconds of her life. Warren Vale's office occupied the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped the room in open sky, the city spread below like something he had personally arranged. He was standing when she entered, not behind his desk, but beside the window, hands clasped behind his back, the same stillness she remembered from the diner, the same blue-gray eyes that missed nothing. He didn't make her wait. "You're wondering why you're here," he said, not a question. Grace lifted her chin slightly. "The thought crossed my mind." The corner of his mouth moved barely, but she caught it. He gestured to the chair across from him and sat only after she did, which she noticed and which she suspected was deliberate. "I've interviewed hundreds of people for hundreds of positions," he said, his voice unhurried. "Credentials, strategies, 5-year plans." He paused. "I watched you spend your last dollar on a child who had nothing to offer you in return. You didn't hesitate. You didn't calculate. You just moved." He leaned forward slightly. "That quality cannot be taught in any university. I have spent 20 years building an empire, Grace. What I have never been able to build is that." The city stretched endlessly behind him, glittering and vast. And Grace realized with a slow, dawning certainty that Warren Vale hadn't hired her despite where she came from. He had hired her precisely because of it. What she didn't yet understand was what that decision was about to unleash. Nobody welcomed her. Not directly. Not with anything Grace could point to and call out as wrong. It was quieter than that, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself but simply exists in a room when she walked in. The slightly too long pause before someone answered her question. The way conversations softened when she approached and sharpened again when she moved away. The smiles that lived only on the surface, never quite reaching the eyes underneath. Vale Industries was a beautiful, brutal world. Her office was small but real, a desk, a window, a nameplate that still surprised her every morning when she touched it. Grace Oak, Director of Community Relations. She would read it once quietly like a prayer she wasn't fully convinced had been answered yet. The work itself she could handle. Warren had given her a clear mandate: build the public face of the company's charitable arm, connect the empire to the communities it affected. It was meaningful work, the kind she understood in her bones. What she hadn't prepared for was the audience watching her do it. They were called the senior leadership team. 6 people, 6 tailored suits, 6 sets of eyes that evaluated everything Grace said in every meeting with the careful precision of people calculating exactly how much of a threat she represented. Their leader, in every way that mattered, was a man named Richard Cole, silver-haired, sharp-tongued. 22 years at Vale Industries, and deeply unhappy that none of those years had produced whatever it was Warren had apparently found in a rundown diner on a Tuesday night. He made his position clear on her 4th day. Grace had just finished presenting her first community outreach proposal, 3 pages, carefully researched, honest in its ambition. The room was quiet when she finished. The good kind of quiet, she'd thought. The considering kind. Then Richard Cole clicked his pen once. "Impressive passion," he said, in the tone people use when passion is the kindest thing they can find to say. "Tell me, Grace, have you worked in corporate philanthropy before?" "No," she said evenly. "Public relations, communications, brand strategy." "No," he smiled. "Then what exactly did you do before this?" The room waited. She felt every second of it pressing against her chest, the ghost of every diner shift, every repaired hem, every folded dollar that was never quite enough. The old Grace would have shrunk, would have apologized for existing in a chair this expensive. She straightened instead. "I learned how to solve real problems for real people," she said quietly, "with whatever I had, which was usually nothing." The room stayed silent. Richard Cole's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did, a small, almost imperceptible recalculation happening behind his eyes. He clicked his pen again and moved on. Grace exhaled slowly, her hands steady beneath the table where no one could see them. She had survived the first strike. She didn't yet know that Richard Cole and Julian Vance had lunch together every single Friday. She heard the name Julian Vance for the first time on a Thursday morning. Not from Warren, not from anyone who meant to tell her. She heard it the way you hear most important things in a corporate building, through a door that wasn't fully closed, in a hallway she wasn't supposed to be standing in, at a moment nobody had planned for. Warren's voice was low and controlled behind the glass partition. The voice of the other man on the speakerphone was neither of those things. "You've made a mistake, Warren." "A sentimental, embarrassing mistake, and I intend to make sure the entire board knows it." A pause. Then Warren, quieter than Grace had ever heard him. "Stay away from my company, Julian. Your company." A short, sharp laugh that had no warmth in it anywhere. "We'll see about that." The call ended. Grace moved away from the hallway before Warren opened his door, but she carried the conversation with her for the rest of the day like a stone she couldn't put down. She did what she always did when something troubled her. She researched. Julian Vance, 51 years old, co-founder of Vale Industries, 17 years ago, alongside a 30-year-old Warren Vale who had nothing but a business plan and an extraordinary mind. Together, they had built something remarkable. Then, 9 years ago, Warren had bought Julian out, quietly, legally, completely. The news articles from that period were careful and corporate and said almost nothing real. But between the careful lines, Grace read what they were too polished to print directly. Julian Vance believed the company was still his. He had never stopped believing it. She found the first press article 3 days later, buried in a financial news feed she had set up for monitoring. Small, precise, planted with the practiced subtlety of someone who knew exactly how these things worked. Sources close to Vale Industries board questioned CEO's recent unconventional hearing decisions, citing concerns over strategic direction. Unconventional hearing decisions. Grace read the phrase twice, felt it settle against her skin like something cold. She was the unconventional hearing decision. Julian Vance had looked at Warren's empire, found its newest and most visible vulnerability, and he had pointed at her. She understood it with a clarity that was almost impressive. She was the easiest argument Julian had. A waitress with no degree, no corporate history, no credentials that any boardroom would recognize. In Julian's hands, Grace wasn't a person. She was a headline waiting to be written. She closed her laptop. Through her small office window, the city stretched out below, indifferent, enormous, full of people making calculations she would never see coming. She thought about the diner. About $1 and a hungry boy and a decision she'd made without thinking. She didn't regret it. But for the first time since she'd walked through Vale Industries' glass doors, she understood that someone was coming for her, and he was already moving. She almost missed it. It was 11:43 on a Wednesday night, and Grace was the last person left on the 42nd floor. Warren had asked her to cross-reference the company's charitable allocations with the new community outreach calendar. She was building routine work, the kind that demanded attention, but not inspiration. The kind best done when the building was quiet and no one was watching over her shoulder calculating her worth. She had been working for 3 hours when she found the folder. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was simply filed under a name that meant nothing at first glance, Project Cornerstone, nested inside the philanthropy archive between 2 larger, more obvious initiatives. Something made her click on it. Instinct, maybe, or the particular feeling that certain doors give you before you open them. What she found inside stopped her completely. 12 residential housing projects, spread across 7 of the city's most struggling neighborhoods, fully funded, quietly maintained. Hundreds of families given stable homes under a foundation that bore no connection to Vale Industries in any public record she had ever seen. No press releases, no charity galas, no Warren Vale accepting awards in front of cameras. Just families, just homes, just the steady, unglamorous work of making sure people had somewhere safe to sleep. She scrolled slowly, her coffee growing cold beside her. Then she saw it. One address stopped her breath entirely. A family housing initiative on Caldwell Street, a building she recognized because she had walked past it once, months before her life changed, on the way to a shift she was already 40 minutes late for. She had noticed it because it was the one clean, well-kept building on a block that had given up trying. She clicked the resident file. Cross-referenced it with the community support list Warren had quietly asked her to begin building her second week on the job. Caleb Reed, age 8, mother single parent, formerly homeless, relocated to stable housing 14 months ago, Caldwell Street. Grace sat back in her chair. The boy with the copper pennies and the splitting sneakers had not wandered into her diner by accident. He had wandered in from a building that Warren Vale had been quietly funding for over a year, a man Caleb had never met, whose name meant nothing to an 8-year-old scraping coins together for a warm meal. Warren had never mentioned it, not once. She heard the elevator open behind her. Quiet footsteps she had learned to recognize over the past weeks. She didn't turn around immediately. "You found it," Warren said simply, not a question. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked. A long pause. When she finally turned to look at him, he was standing by the window, the city lights mapping quiet shadows across his face. "Because it was never about the recognition," he said. Grace looked back at Caleb's name on her screen, and suddenly she understood exactly what Julian Vance was truly trying to destroy. The gala was not her world. Grace knew it the moment she stepped into the Harrington Grand Ballroom, a cathedral of chandeliers and expensive perfume, where every conversation happening simultaneously was about money, and every laugh was perfectly calibrated to land exactly where it needed to. She wore a simple black dress she had borrowed from a colleague and heels that were half a size too small. She had told herself all evening that nobody would notice either detail. She was probably right. Nobody here was looking at her, until someone was. She felt him before she saw him. A shift in the air near the ballroom's side exit, the particular quality of attention that arrives before the person carrying it does. She had stepped outside for air just 2 minutes, just enough to remember how to breathe, when the door opened behind her and Julian Vance walked out. He was shorter than she expected. Compact. Well-dressed in the effortless way of men who have never once had to think about what things cost. His hair was silver at the sides, and his eyes were the flat, assessing gray of someone who had long ago decided that people were primarily useful. He smiled at her like they were old friends. "Grace Oak," he said warmly, as if her name in his mouth was a perfectly ordinary thing. "I've been hoping we'd get a moment." She didn't move. "Mr. Vance." He joined her at the railing, resting his hands beside hers, looking out at the city the way powerful men do, like it belongs to them and they are simply allowing everyone else to live in it. "I'll be direct," he said pleasantly. "I respect your time." She waited. "Warren has made you the public face of his philanthropic arm." He tilted his head slightly. "Which means when this company goes through its upcoming transition, you become the most visible casualty. The press will find your story fascinating. A waitress, debt, no qualifications." He paused, letting each word settle individually. "I've seen careers end on far less." Grace felt the cold of the railing beneath her fingers. She focused on the specific, real temperature of the metal, and kept her face completely still. "However," Julian continued, and his voice softened in a way that was somehow worse than the sharpness, "if you were to share certain information about Warren's current board strategy, nothing dramatic, just the truth between colleagues, I could ensure your transition out is very comfortable, very quiet." He finally looked at her directly. "Everyone walks away clean. You go back to your life. No headlines, no embarrassment." The city hummed below them, indifferent and vast. Grace thought about Caleb's name on a housing file, about 12 buildings on 7 streets, about a man who had spent years doing good things in complete silence. She looked at Julian Vance steadily. "I'll need to get back inside," she said quietly. She turned and walked through the door without another word, but Julian Vance's smile as she left told her everything. He wasn't finished. He was just getting started. The morning of the summit, Grace woke up at 4. She didn't set an alarm. Her body simply refused to sleep past it, the way it used to refuse on mornings when the rent was due and the numbers didn't work no matter how many times she ran them. That particular kind of wakefulness. The kind that lives in the stomach, not the mind. She dressed carefully, slowly, the way you prepare for something that cannot be undone. The Meridian Conference Center was already crowded when she arrived at 7:30. News vans lined the street outside, 3 of them, cameras mounted and ready, which told Grace everything about how carefully Julian Vance had orchestrated this morning. Emergency shareholder meetings didn't attract cameras by accident. Someone had made phone calls. Someone had promised a story worth filming. The room inside held 200 seats. Every one of them was filled. Warren was already at the front, seated at the long executive table with the remaining board members arranged on either side like a jury that hadn't yet decided which way to fall. He looked composed. He always looked composed. But Grace had spent enough mornings in his office to recognize the particular stillness that wasn't peace. It was control, held tightly, costing something. He caught her eye briefly as she took her seat. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Julian Vance entered at 8 o'clock precisely. He walked to the presenter's podium with the unhurried confidence of a man who had already decided how this ended. He adjusted the microphone, surveyed the room with visible satisfaction, and opened a leather folder with the theatrical calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times. He began with numbers. Clean, damaging, carefully selected financial comparisons between Vail Industries' last 2 quarters. He used words like instability and misalignment of priorities and erosion of shareholder confidence, corporate language weaponized into something that sounded almost reasonable. Then he turned the page. "Perhaps most concerning," Julian said, his voice carrying perfectly to every corner of the room and directly into the camera lenses positioned along the back wall, "is the question of leadership judgment." He clicked a button. Grace's photograph appeared on the main screen behind him, her Vail Industries ID photo, clean and professional, beside a second image she recognized immediately. The diner. Her diner, with its cracked signage and its flickering fluorescent light visible through the window. "Warren Vail's newly appointed Director of Community Relations," Julian announced, "is a woman with no degree, no corporate experience, and no qualification beyond a single encounter in a rundown diner that Mr. Vail apparently found moving." Soft, deliberate laughter moved through a section of the room. Grace felt every pair of eyes find her simultaneously. 200 people and 3 cameras, all arriving at her face at the same moment. Her hands were completely still in her lap. But inside her chest, something that had been quiet for weeks was finally beginning to rise. And Julian Vance had no idea what he had just awakened. Before we continue, dearest, let us know in the comment section where in the world you're tuning in from. We love seeing how far our stories can reach. And if this story speaks to you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe just to encourage us to do better. Grace stood up. It wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of musical swelling, no theatrical pause for effect. She simply placed both hands flat on her knees, pushed herself to her feet, and stood in the middle of 200 people who were still looking at her photograph on a screen. The room noticed immediately. Julian Vance noticed too. His eyes found her from the podium, a quick, sharp assessment, like a man recalculating a distance he thought he already knew. Then the corners of his mouth lifted slightly. An invitation. He gestured toward the front of the room with the relaxed generosity of someone completely certain they have already won. "By all means," he said smoothly. "The floor." Grace walked to the podium. She had no folder, no presentation, no slides prepared the night before with carefully selected numbers and weaponized language. She had one printed document folded in her jacket pocket, placed there at 6 that morning after she had made a decision she hadn't fully explained to anyone, including herself. She set it on the podium, left it folded, looked out at the room. "My name is Grace Oak," she said clearly. "I grew up with very little. I worked in a diner for 4 years. I have no degree and no corporate background." She paused. "Mr. Vance has already covered that, so I won't." Silence. The clean, attentive kind. "What I will tell you is what I found when I started working inside this company." She reached down and unfolded the document slowly. 12 housing projects across 7 neighborhoods, 431 families in stable homes, a medical fund that has covered emergency care for 212 children in the past 3 years alone. She looked up. None of it announced, none of it photographed. None of it used to generate a single positive headline for Vail Industries or for Warren Vail personally. She let that settle. "Mr. Vance has presented you with 2 quarters of financial data and called it a pattern." Her voice stayed level and clear. "What he hasn't presented is this, his own trading records from the 18 months before this meeting, which show a consistent, illegal pattern of short-selling Vail Industries stock immediately before negative press stories that his own team planted." The room shifted, physically shifted, the sound of 200 people changing their posture simultaneously. Julian Vance's expression didn't break. but the color drained from his face in a slow, unmistakable tide. "I was a waitress," Grace said quietly, her eyes moving across the room. "I know what it looks like when someone is genuinely trying to help people, and I know what it looks like when someone is simply trying to take something that was never theirs." She stepped back from the podium. The room was absolutely still. Then one board member near the back closed his folder, leaned forward, and looked directly at Julian Vance. "I think," he said carefully, "we need to hear an explanation." Grace returned to her seat and finally, let out a slow, quiet breath. But across the room, Warren Vale was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, and it would change everything that came next. 6 months later, Grace Oak was no longer afraid of elevators. It was a small thing, the kind of detail nobody else would notice or celebrate. But she noticed it on a Tuesday morning as the doors closed on the 42nd floor, and she rode down alone, coffee in one hand, a rolled set of architectural plans tucked under her arm, completely at ease inside a life that had once felt like someone else's. A lot had changed since the summit. Julian Vance had resigned 4 days after the emergency meeting, quietly and without a public statement, which was the corporate equivalent of disappearing into the night. The trading investigation that followed his resignation was still ongoing. She had been told not to discuss specifics, which suited her fine. She had never been interested in his destruction, only in the truth. Richard Cole had requested a meeting with her the following week. He had sat across from her in her office, the one with the nameplate she used to touch like a prayer, and told her, with the careful dignity of a man unaccustomed to this particular exercise, that her presentation had been the most effective thing he had witnessed in 22 years at Vale Industries. She had thanked him and meant it. Warren had offered her a full equity partnership 3 weeks after the summit, in the same unhurried way he did everything, sitting beside the window, city spread below, letting the offer exist in the room without pressure. She had asked for a week to think. She had used all 7 days. Then she had walked back into his office and accepted on 2 conditions: that she lead the philanthropic arm independently, with full decision-making authority, and that Project Cornerstone be expanded to 5 additional neighborhoods within the year. He had agreed without hesitation. Both things had already begun. The community center on Caldwell Street was finished on a bright Thursday in early spring, and Grace arrived before anyone else. She stood in the empty main hall for a few minutes, listening to the particular silence of a new building, the smell of fresh paint and clean floors and possibility, and she let herself feel the full, quiet weight of how far $1 could travel when it was spent with the right intention. They arrived together, which she hadn't expected. Warren came through the door first, hands in his coat pockets, looking slightly less composed than usual in a way she had come to recognize as his version of moved. Behind him, holding the door with enormous 8-year-old seriousness, was Caleb. He was taller. His sneakers were new, both of them. He saw Grace and his whole face opened like a window. She crossed the floor and crouched to his level the same way she had in the diner, on a night that felt like another lifetime, and looked directly into his large hazel brown eyes. "What do you think?" she asked. Caleb looked around the bright, clean hall with the focused evaluation of someone taking this responsibility seriously. Then he looked back at her. "It's really good, Grace," he said simply. She smiled, the real kind, the kind that starts somewhere deep and arrives on your face without asking permission. Behind her, she heard Warren exhale slowly, the sound of a man setting down something heavy he had carried a very long time. Grace stood up straight. She looked at the building around her, at the walls that would hold after-school programs and job training and warm meals, and every quiet, unglamorous form of help that never makes headlines but changes lives completely. She thought about $1, one bowl of stew, one decision made without calculation, without strategy, without any expectation that the world would answer back. It had built this, and she was just getting started. The most powerful thing Grace ever did wasn't her speech at the summit. It was crouching down to a hungry child's level when nobody was watching, and doing it anyway. Lessons derived from the story of Grace and Warren. Genuine kindness always finds its way back to you. Grace spent her last $1 with zero expectation of return. That single selfless act unlocked a life she never dared to dream for herself. Your character is worth more than your credentials. Grace had no degree, no resume, no corporate experience. But she had integrity, and that was the one thing Warren's billions could never manufacture or replace. Never let where you come from make you forget who you are. Every shark in that boardroom tried to use Grace's poverty against her. Instead, she used it as her greatest strength, because she knew what really mattered and they had forgotten long ago.